So, hello to everyone.
Hello everyone, nice meeting you, nice having you here.
It's a pleasure having you here, of course, dear Louis. Дозвольте
Подякувати
So, I would like to thank people who joined this important event, I think. And today we are going to talk about memory, identity, and future from the standpoint of commemorative practices of memorialization and the complicated past. And first of all, before introducing Mr. Louis, Mr.
ви можете зліва в кутку
So if you need
підійдеться, взяти
translation, you can take headphones.
і feel free. У нас буде також трансляція
And
паралельно в Фейсбуці.
in parallel, we are going to have YouTube and Facebook broadcasting, so and streaming. We are glad to greet our online audience, and we can talk a lot about Mr. Bikford. He's a professor in Columbia University, well-known memory scientist and scholar, a kind of social constructor of memories in societies. But I'm not going to speak and waste time. I'll give the floor to Olga Kotyuk. It's our partners, and they made this event possible. Thank you, Anton, and thank you for coming. And I'm not going to steal your time. Just I'm going to say that we are glad to see Louis in this audience as part of the stabilization program supporting Ukraine that is organized by the UK, US, Canada, Finland, and Sweden and Switzerland. And the topic of justice, transitional justice, is very important, and it's very supported by our partners. And I also would like to thank Kyiv Economy School, who are open for cooperation and helped us to organize this event. And now I'm giving the floor to Louis. Yeah, and a couple of words from my side as well. You know that we have a master program in memory studies and public history master program, and we are happy that the
is a reality and is really possible and needed, absolutely, because Ukraine, as you know, is needed for public discussion on this very, very sensitive, sometimes very difficult issues like memory, like transitional justice, like humanities knowledge at all. And floor is yours. Thank you.
Отже,
Well, thank you so much for the invitation. I'm very happy to be here. Let me tell you a little bit about what I'm going to do today. The modest thing I'm going to try and do today. Does this say memory work? Okay. So let me see. Okay, so this is basically what I'd like to try and do in the time that we have. And I'm very aware that we have real experts in the room on the topic of memory studies and what it means to remember mass atrocity in the past. And so the modest task that I have here is, first of all, to share with you some international experiences. So these are experiences from other countries that have gone through very different experiences. And I just want to acknowledge that at the outset, that we're talking about really, really very different experiences. So I think direct analogies, direct kind of prescriptions that might emerge from these examples are unlikely. It's unlikely to find kind of direct kind of lessons. But the idea is really more about broadening the imagination of what this kind of genre is about. What I sometimes call memory works or the memory scape. I'll come to that in a second. the different forms of articulation of physical memory on a public landscape. So the idea is to think creatively about that, and hopefully some of these examples will be useful in that way. You may have heard of some of them. None of them directly refer to Ukraine. The second thing is to locate this conversation in the broader conversation of accountability. Accountability for mass atrocity. There's no clear definition for the term mass atrocity. The legal definition we could take from the Rome Statute to take the three major crimes articulated in the Rome Statute, which are crimes against humanity, war crimes, and genocide. Crime of aggression being the fourth one. But in any case, I'm going to call that, I'm not a lawyer, so I'm allowed to get away with some different kinds of conceptual use of terms. I'm going to call that mass atrocity. So the question here is, how do we have some lawyers in the room. Yeah. The question is, how do you use this kind of memory framework to remember, to fit this into the broader conversation of accountability? So I think the accountability movement, I'm going to call it a movement, the global movement towards accountability. I usually start that history in 1983. Obviously, you can go back to Nuremberg, and you can even go back to ancient Greece. But I think the modern accountability movement in many ways begins in Argentina in 1983. Again, a very different context. And at this moment, 1983, 1984, 1985, looking at a period of brutal violence in Argentina, human rights activists began to articulate a three-part vision of accountability. And that is basically justicia, verdad, memoria. Justice, truth, memory. So these are three kind of different aspects, overlapping, related aspects of what we talk about when we talk about accountability in the Latin American context in the Southern Cone. So let's look at these three pieces. First piece, justicia, justice. Here, what are we talking? So if accountability is a response to impunity, what is going on with this form of accountability? Justice, using the criminal justice system. Well, it's accountability for impunity, meaning lack of consequences for wrongdoing. That's the impunity being addressed, right? When something is done that is wrong, we expect consequences as a reaction. If there are no consequences, that's a lack of accountability, that's a kind of impunity. So this is the military junta. They were successfully put on trial in Argentina. There's, by the way, a very good movie. It was nominated for an Academy Award called Argentina 1985. Highly recommend. So this is that kind of classic form of judicial accountability. Milosevic, the international criminal tribunals, we have Yugoslavia, Rwanda, we have universal jurisdiction. I'm not going to talk about any of this. We do have people in the room who can talk about it, but these kind of judicial approaches to war crimes and crimes against humanity. That's plank one, part one of the accountability matrix. Second one is truth. What is truth a response to? Truth is a response to lies, and lies are a form of impunity. So truth is a form of accountability. So telling the truth is an adjacent and complementary part of an accountability strategy, especially because lies are a form of impunity. This is the Truth Commission in Morocco. Truth commissions are just one form of truth-telling. There are multiple forms of truth-telling. Truth commissions have a certain cachet and fame, but there are multiple other forms of truth-telling. This is an example in the Moroccan case where victims were given the opportunity to explain what had happened to them and to be listened to be heard, to have society hear them and recognize. Recognition is a very important part of this. this is a very, very interesting case. I'm not sure how closely people have followed the case of the what's called the falsos positivos in Colombia. So this is an opportunity that was created, and I imagine this will be interesting to people, but we can talk about it perhaps later. It was an opportunity created for perpetrators to admit exactly what they had done and to be heard by the victims and to have an exchange, a restorative justice exchange. So on the left, you see representatives of the victims' families, and on the right, you see perpetrators who had actually committed these terrible crimes. And this is a very, very long process. And it was a long process in which, if you find, I have this video, I can share it with you. You hear this guy here, he's saying, I do not deserve forgiveness. I do not deserve, I am not, I don't deserve your respect. I was a monster when I committed those crimes. He's not trying to escape responsibility, actually. He's trying to embrace his own responsibility. It's a fascinating example of a restorative justice case. You don't see that many of these in the world, in my experience. Usually perpetrators are not remorseful. These perpetrators are remorseful. But that's in part because of a very sophisticated set of mechanisms that were created under what was called the HEP. The HEP is it's a Spanish acronym, anyway. Okay, so this is all by way of introduction to bring us to memory and what I'll call the memoryscape. And no, Victor Scott, if we have a great translation for memoryscape. Anyway, the landscape of physical memory, the landscape of built and created memory. So this is what you see constantly without knowing it. Actually, you don't see it, right? You actually don't notice it most of the time. Some of the time you do. But when you're walking in the street, there's street signs, there are statues, there are monuments, memorials, museums. Sometimes these become highlighted and very, very visible. This is a wonderful case of the AIDS quilt in Washington, D.C., which was unfurled and took up blocks and blocks. So very, very visible memory initiative. But oftentimes you don't necessarily notice memory initiatives when they're being created. So this is what I want to look at today is really what I'm calling the memoryscape. So the place that I like to really start with this is with a short story by Borges, the Argentine short story or the author, called Funes el Memorioso. Has anybody ever read Funes el Memorioso by any chance? It's a wonderful, wonderful short story. I imagine it's translated into multiple languages. It's in English and Spanish, obviously. So Funes is a character who has a terrible disease. He has it's not a disease, actually. He falls, he hits his head. As a result of hitting his head, he has this affliction. And the affliction is that he remembers everything. Now just imagine that for a second. How devastating that would be to remember everything. I mean, on some level, this is very obvious. On another level, we never think about it. So in Funes' case, he remembers every leaf on every tree. He remembers every face he ever sees. He remembers every time he remembers every leaf on every tree. Can you imagine how devastating that would be? He can't do anything. He's immobilized. He sits in a dark room because he can't, it's impossible to remember everything. So that's an obvious point and made in this very nice literary way. But the real reason it's interesting is because we all make some kind of selections about what we remember. So then the question is why? Why are we making certain selections? Sometimes we don't really choose a selection. You know, if I get badly hurt in an accident, then the accident imposes itself on me. I'll always remember that, perhaps. But there are other forms of selection of memory, selectivity of memory, that are really at the core of this discussion back to the memoryscape, because our memoryscape is constructed, and it is constructed with ideas and narratives and norms, and I would. Okay, that's the Funes one. And this one says, why and how will the past be remembered? Okay, so I would suggest, the one dream I would have of today is that we all have a heightened awareness of what is on the memoryscape and what is not on the memoryscape. Where are the absences? Think about the absences. The most famous absence is perhaps, in my view, is perhaps the gender question, right? The memoryscape is highly gendered. So we're more likely to see a statue such as this Kosovo Liberation Army statue of a man with a gun. That's a more likely kind of statue than to see something that celebrates the women of World War II and the roles in which they played. It's not saying one is good and one is bad. It's just simply saying that we're less likely to see the stories of women's contribution during conflict, for example. Right? We're more likely to see this image on the memoryscape. So back to this. When we walk around, what do we see? What is there? What is not there? Charles Tilly, who is a great sociologist, argued that most monuments are either about credit or blame, and that this is actually a problem. It's a problem because it keeps conflict kind of going on some level. Now, again, there's no judgment here about whether or not it's appropriate to blame or to have credit. The question is, since we're adding to the memoryscape all the time, what choices are we making? The credit and blame framework of credit and blame would say that when we look at something, do we see something that says, look how great we are, look how bad they are? Is that what's happening on the memoryscape? Again, it's a question, something to think about. So back to this, what are the absences? What are the gaps? What are we not seeing? What are the stories that are not being told? What are the community stories that are not being told? What are the stories of different kinds of heroism that are not being told necessarily? I love this Women of World War, it's World War I, is it? Yeah, it's Women of World War I. But this was created recently, 2005. And this is in Whitehall. This is right next to the Cenotaph, the most important national memory location in all of the United Kingdom, you could argue. And this was basically, the people who founded this memorial basically said, there is a massive gap. There is a huge emptiness here of the stories of women's contribution during World War I. We need to fill that gap in this national space, in this national narrative. So I think that's around 2005 that's created. So what would be some of the reasons we create memory sites, memory spaces, physical memory of some kind? Well, the most obvious one is to mourn. That's kind of the most obvious reason. And we have some very age-old motifs here. Cemetery. A cemetery is a form of memory site, right? And by the way, I'm fascinated by cemeteries. I'm fascinated by the degree to which they're public spaces or sacred spaces or spaces that tell stories. They obviously tell stories. But anyway, I'm sort of getting away from the fundamental reason of a cemetery, which is probably mostly to mourn. There's a lot of memorial art out there focused on this idea. This is the Vietnam War memorial in Washington, D.C. There are a lot of design principles we could also talk about. I imagine we have design, people who are interested in design in the room. This is quite famous for its innovations, design innovations. Very simple things like having a reflective surface so you can see yourself in it. Having the names be chronological instead of alphabetical, so you need to search for a name. You need to touch it. The architect really wanted people to touch it and engage with it. They wanted people to have that tactile experience with it. So anyway, there's a lot there, and this is kind of the sort of first and most obvious form of memory. A second one that I particularly like is the idea of celebrating. Celebrating individuals, celebrating things that have happened in the past, even in times of devastation and war and crisis. So this is one of my favorite projects for a variety of reasons. It's in a small town in Chile where approximately, I think, something like 50 people had been killed during a very particular period of time. I think it was over a month or two in 1974, and or 1973. There we go, October 1973, and the family members. So the other thing that's interesting about this is the process. So there's a process here. One of the lessons that I think people who spend a lot of time in this field would say is that creating a monument or a memorial from the top down, sort of saying this is what it's going to be, and overly focus on producing it, is actually to miss a huge opportunity to develop a participatory process that would actually create a far better kind of memorial, and this is a great example of that. So in this case, the family members connected with graduate students, art students from Santiago. Paine is outside of Santiago. The art students came and they said, okay, what should we do? And the family member said, we want to do something, but we don't know what. And so they had a conversation. And the conversation led to the idea of creating mosaics. And so the art students taught the family members how to build mosaics. And the first workshop was about how you build a mosaic. And the second workshop was about how they're going to represent their children in the mosaics. And the third one was the design. And the fourth one was where they were going to put them. And the fifth one was, and this took a year. And during the year, each family member learned how to build mosaics, learned how to create the mosaics, designed a mosaic for their loved one, and created these very celebratory mosaics to represent their loved ones. So this is one of my absolute favorite projects because it combines so many different pieces of this. It doesn't focus on the tragedy and the sadness. Of course, we need monuments and memorials that focus on tragedy and sadness, so I'm not making an argument against that. In fact, I think the main argument here is always an additive argument, right? I'm never talking about one thing I'm hardly ever talking about don't do something. I'm more saying also do something. And in this case, this is a great example of something that is not about tragedy. It's about celebration of life. It's about color. It's about vibrancy. It's about love. And it's a very powerful process in creating it. Obviously, historical fact, history telling is a really important part of memory. This is, some of you may have been to the Gauck Authority, which is one of the most sophisticated archives, maybe, in the world, I think it's fair to say. It's in Berlin. It was Joachim Gauck, who was a member of parliament in 1990, led a group of people to occupy the archives in East Berlin at the moment of the fall of the Berlin Wall, or shortly thereafter said, do not touch these archives. This is the Stasi archives. We are going to protect these forever, and have turned it into an amazing site of memory. Has anybody been there? You can visit it. You can visit it, and if you're in the archive, then you absolutely have access anytime. If your name is in the archive, and there are thousands and thousands of people whose name is in the archive, are in the archive. But even if you're not in the archive, you can get access to it, and it's an amazing space in Berlin. Berlin is an amazing site for all of these kinds of memory works, as I'm sure many of you know. There's also the idea of contributing, and this comes from the beginning of the talk as well. We're talking about a broader framework of accountability, supporting accountability measures. So for, the Cambodian case, there was an international tribunal in Cambodia. I have very mixed feelings about that tribunal. We can talk about that separately if you want. But regardless of the feelings that I have for that tribunal, there's no doubt that all the memory sites in Cambodia, the sites of the killing fields, the sites of the former school, there was a torture center called Tulsling, these all really helped contribute to the possibility of a trial. And they helped contribute to the possibility of a trial, which was a genocide trial, essentially because they helped create these narratives of what had actually happened. So there was an element, these are very hard, it's very hard to disagree with these. These are children, photographs of children who were kept in these torture centers and then killed. So devastating, sad photographs, and there are thousands of them. And having those there for years and years before the trial was able to take place was able to support, I think, the kind of support for or narratives for the trial. I think memorial art can help to grapple with difficult questions. This one I'm not going to talk about quite so much, although it is a very interesting idea. This is in Mostar, in Bosnia-Herzegovina. And the idea was to create a monument to agreement. It's a concept, right? This conceptual art. So they said, well, what do we agree on? They said, well, we don't agree on anything. But we all agree on, we liked Bruce Lee. So it's one thing that everybody could agree on, right? So they built a monument to agreement. So it's a high-level conceptual art, but anyway, it's not there anymore, which also might say something. But nonetheless, the idea here was there is a memory component to this, right? This is conceptual art trying to remember shared childhood in Bosnia-Herzegovina, in which Serbians, Croats, Bosniaks were all watching Bruce Lee movies. And so it's a monument to a memory, a kind of solidarity memory. So anyway, something that I think is interesting in terms of asking hard questions. Then there's this big idea, and this is kind of the biggest idea, I think. The biggest idea here really is, how can the memoryscape help, and it's in the title of the talk, right? How can memoryscape help to contribute to our future identity, to the identity of who we want to be, of who we are in the future? So construction of identity is a very complicated idea, but at a minimum, it does involve some kind of resonance with the physical built environment, right? That's part of construction of identity, is when we see resonances in everything from street names to the broader memoryscape, as well as many, many other factors. Obviously, it's a very complex, layered idea. But in terms of the particular memory component of construction of identity, what does it mean to think about future identity and who we want to be? The we here is obviously completely open to whoever the we is that we're talking about at any given moment. So I like to give this example of the Colombian National Museum. This is in Bogota, Colombia. I have been going to Colombia for about 10 or 12 years, and I go about once or twice a year, and I almost always go to the museum. It's a small museum, but that gives me a very particular way of engaging with this museum. I go once a year. So I go once a year, and I sort of see it over time. And it has changed quite a bit over time, the Colombian National Museum. And of course, this is one way of talking about the identity of what it means to be Colombian. So when I first started going 10 or 12 years ago, there was a floor called the History of Colombia. And this was the history of Colombia. A portrait of a man, 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 right? And not just a man, but a military man, right? So that's the history of Colombia. So let's pause and reflect on that for a second. It's about how we tell history. We tell history by looking at political military leaders, which tend to be men. We tell history for even more crass gendered reasons. Because men are telling the history, there are a lot of reasons that this is the history that gets told. And this is same thing, portrait of a man, portrait of a man. This is the museum today. And it's absolutely fascinating. They no longer have a separate floor that's called the History of Colombia. Now all three floors are about kind of a mix. It's non-linear, which is a different question, but we can come to that because that's also very interesting. It's non-linear, but it is much more mixed together, culture, history. And this is the main hall. It now occupies, they tore down part of the floor. So this now is 2 floors high. And it's an amazing space to stand in. Like if you actually go stand here, stand in the middle of this floor, and just look at this, this is now what the identity of Colombia they're trying to communicate, right? It's one that involves indigenous people, it involves struggle, it involves anti-colonial struggle, it involves women, it involves men, it involves different landscapes, industrialization. So totally different than that other kind of version that I encountered when I first started going there. Okay, that takes me to pretty much the last idea I want to talk about, which I've mentioned, and very happy to also open it up for as much conversation as people want to have, which is, again, the memory for the future, construction of identity for the future. One of the, I think, objectively speaking, most impressive memory sites in the world is the Hiroshima Peace Memorial Museum and the island. I don't know if anybody's been there. It's a remarkable space. It has a bunch of different components. It has very decentralized small memorials all over the place. So there's a memorial to the, toothbrush factory workers is over here, and they're just all over the place. And then another to Korean refugees, and a lot of small memorials. There's also the very large memorial and what's called the A-bomb dome, the atomic bomb dome in the back. I don't know the number, but it's at least 500 school children who visit every single day. Now, the city charter of the city of Hiroshima, the city charter, has a mission in it. As far as I know, most cities don't have a mission. And the mission is to prevent nuclear war. So the entire city of Hiroshima is based on the idea, it exists in part to prevent nuclear war. And this entire site is about preventing nuclear war. So I don't know what, I've actually never, I've been back and forth to Hiroshima many times. And I have a sense of people who've grown up there as being people who have a deep commitment to this idea that their identity is in part about preventing nuclear war. I think the idea of identifying heroes, there's a word in English that I like to use, and I know there's not a good translation, but I like to use the word sheroes, heroes and sheroes. So heroes are male heroes, sheroes are female heroes. But the idea of identifying new forms of heroism, not so much new forms, but because they're not new, they're kind of obvious forms. There's a strain of Holocaust remembrance, and the most famous example is Schindler's List. That's the most famous example. And what a wonderful movie that is. What a wonderful narration of memory that is. But there is a strain of Holocaust remembrance that is about rescuers, about a certain set of heroes who played those kinds of roles. This exhibit was meant to take that same strain of kind of reinventing or thinking about new forms of heroes in multiple contexts, including Rwanda and Burundi. So thinking more about new forms of heroes and heroism. This is a project I was involved in, which was in Colombia now, going back to Colombia. There was a Truth Commission in Colombia, and the Truth Commission was focused very much on evidence gathering of massacres and crimes against humanity. So I was involved with a project that was supposed to complement that work by talking about stories of hope and resilience. And so we basically collected hundreds of stories from communities and then used community radio stations and local forms of diffusion to distribute those audio pieces that talked about inspiring stories of hope, inspiring stories of people helping each other, the rescuer kind of model, et cetera, in communities throughout Colombia. I think that everyday heroes, this is one of the many civil rights memorials in the US. Most of them, I think, go with the kind of big man theory of history. So Martin Luther King is an important figure, but some of them are much more interesting, I think, much more around the social movements that drove this movement in the United States. I personally don't like the individual theory of history so much. So like, for example, when I think of South Africa, I don't only think of Nelson Mandela. I also think of the ANC and the very powerful peace movements and other movements, anti-apartheid movements. And same with, other kinds of movements. They are generated by a lot of different people. So everyday forms of resistance. And then the idea of transforming spaces. I went here yesterday. I assume a number of you have been here. I love this. What a great idea. Transforming the art arsenal, or the arsenal, right, this space, into this incredibly vibrant, colorful, festive space. So I think that idea of transforming spaces is also about the future. So I'll stop there and I'll just leave you with that question of what does it mean to build a memoryscape? What does it mean to contribute to it? Some of it you've inherited. We've all inherited something. When we walk out into the streets, we've obviously already inherited something. But what is missing from that? What could be changed? What could be rearranged? What could be added to that? Where are the gaps? What stories are not being told? And how can we tell stories that will reinforce the kind of future that we want? And again, just to wrap back around to the very, very beginning, I see a big part of that as being located in this broader question of accountability for the past and remembering, in part, as a form of justice. So maybe I'll stop there and see if there are comments, et cetera. Yeah?
Thank you so much for your, very insightful highlights and very insightful presentation. And maybe someone, okay, I will pass the word to Anton.
Great.
Hello.
Hi.
First of all, thank you very much for your good... It's okay?
Yeah,
Yeah.
I hear you.
First of all, thank you very much for your perfect lecture. My name is Anton, and I have one specific question and one general question with appeal to your experience, professor experience, and etc. First of all, maybe can you share with us some potent researchers about influence of memorialization on reconciliation or just building process in general? Some scientific researchers. And second question about your experience. We know a broad, popular thought that if you know history very well, you can be good people, good man or woman. Is it true, or this is only hypothesis? Thank you.
Wow, what great questions. On the first one, I think the best place to look for the kind of empirical research is probably on things that look at narrative change, like how narratives are created. And actually, do I have all the slides in here? Let me just see. Yeah, but no, I have tons of slides. Okay, hold on. This is going to be way down at the end. I have a nice slide here about where Americans, it's Americans in this case, but still it's research that could be done in other places, where Americans get their historical information. Let me see if I can find this quickly. Yeah, this is a lot of, here we go. Okay, that's it. So this is Americans in particular, but again, you could do this other places through public opinion research and stuff like that. So the question is where Americans get their information, historical information, and how they construct historical narratives. And you see here, these ones like museum visit is there, it's relevant, it's 35%, so it's something. Wikipedia fascinates me in particular. I've been focusing a lot on the gaps in Wikipedia. There are huge gaps in Wikipedia. So there are also efforts to try and change Wikipedia in English and other places. Of course, TV news, TV is probably the primary place people get, in the United States anyway, this is DNA test, current history lecture, video games. But anyway, this kind of information, and then that's one bunch of kind of research that I think is really interesting. And then the other is how you measure narrative change around different things. And there are ways to measure it. You can measure narrative change through public opinion research, through baseline changes over time. But it's difficult to do that. But I think that's where some of the it's very difficult to make the causal relationship, obviously, with a monument or something. But on the other hand, you know, you could, I think there are a lot of ways that a lot of the big museums have directly affected the way people think about things in the past. So I think there is some empirical research out there about that. And then the second part of the question was?
History and good persons.
Well, no. I mean, of course, I mean, I hope everyone is aware that we have also a major expert on this theme right here. I mean, I don't know if I'm allowed to point that out, but anyway, I recognize your expertise on this, and I'd be curious to know what your answer to that would be. My answer to that is that all history is interpretation, and all of this is about power relations. I mean, that's something I didn't talk so much about, is how this is fraught stuff. These are power relationships going on. Who has power on the memoryscape? Because there are hegemonic narratives that are created by powerful actors. Some of those powerful actors are media stations, media conglomerates. Some of those powerful actors are historical figures, you know, individuals. There's a political economy here of power. There's a gendered question that I've already raised of power. So the question of negotiating power on the memoryscape is the same with history, I think. I mean, history is, who's telling the history? How are they telling the history? What are they emphasizing in the history? So anyway, I don't know if you have any reflections on your own question.
Okay, could I ask questions to follow in your answer, if you don't mind?
Yeah.
Relationship between power, between commemoration practices or commemorization practices, community ideology, and maybe the state at all.
Yeah.
And what do you think about it? Because for now, who are actors in Ukraine? You know, what difference between a lot of communities? There's a local authorities or someone else should create monuments, should create a lot of forms of memorialization, and how potentially it can be powerful or not, ideologically or not, and etc.
I mean, I don't know the answer for Ukraine at all. I mean, I think but the balance of those things is kind of the question. I mean, one of the things, the reason I started with the human rights movement is because I think the human rights, okay, so within the space of human rights actors, you know, human rights nonprofit organizations, social movements all over the world in the 80s, talking about memory was a radical idea. It was a radical idea because they said we can actually contest memory, and they brought to that a kind of way of thinking about history and memory that was, I think, really innovative. So in that case, you have NGOs playing this particular role because they've said, we're going to actually really advocate for a different kind of memory here. But it's all around those different balances. I mean, I don't think there's an easy answer, right? Power relationships, local communities. It would be facile to say that local communities should always define their own memory, right? I mean, in my case, in the United States case, if you said that, then you would have to be consistent with a white supremacist community deciding that they were going to tell the community story as being only about the importance of white people, right? Which would be terrible. So you can't, I think it's facile to say the local always is superior to something else, right? But the spirit of the local is also very powerful, which is people should define their own communities and how they talk about their own communities. So I guess it has to do with cross-fertilization, some kind of conversation between the local and the regional and the national and the international. The international, in my view, should play just the role of being a kind of, reminder of other things that have happened, if that's useful. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know in the Ukraine case. Yeah.
Just to flag, we have first question here.
Yeah.
Hi,
Hi.
my name is Darka.
Hi.
My question is if you actually had a chance to check some Ukrainian memorials, and what can you say? Did you see some, I don't know, successful samples?
Well, first of all, I'm amazed by how many museums there are in Kyiv. There's so many. Does anybody know how many there are? There are like 40, 50, 60. I went to the Museum of One Street. Does anybody know that little museum? And I love that little museum. I love little museums. It's not a political museum, as far as I can tell. I couldn't actually understand a lot of the text. But, and then I also went to the Art Arsenal thing. Olga, I don't know if you want to mention anything about it. Okay, no?
That's you, the speaker.
No, I know, but I mean, I know that, anyway. The Art Arsenal exhibit was wonderful, but otherwise, the Holodomor thing is amazing. Also, I think that's a world-class kind of narrative, but it is one that focuses on very painful experiences. I don't really have an answer to that other than a very piecemeal, little bits and pieces. I haven't been here very long. What I've seen is, I think, very impressive from the point of view of architecture and design and amazing commemorative arts and monuments. You have obviously the left. I'm just talking. I'm not making any interesting observations. So no, I don't have any. But I'm learning.
Hi, my name is Ola. I wanted to ask you about, I don't know how you're aware of the decommunization process in Ukraine, but there is this process and it's been very active during the past 10 years, and we keep changing the names of the streets from, the streets named after the communist posters, or we keep changing the monuments. Like recently we removed some Soviet symbols from some monuments dedicated to the Second World War. So we are removing or rethinking the existing symbols of the communistic regime for the obvious reasons, because it brings us a lot of pain due to the current events. What is your opinion on that? Because at some point of history it was important, and that's how people would perceive, how they would keep that memory. Yeah. But now, for us, that is something we don't want to accept. Does that mean that we have a kind of short, memory, and we do not want to memorize things for a long time? Is that fine? Do you have maybe some other examples of, some other countries and context when that would be happening? And what's your opinion on this rethinking, changing, not keeping?
I love it. Yeah.
Say?
Yeah, it's a great question. And actually, I have in maybe another version of the presentation, I would talk about erasure, the whole question of erasure. I am my default reaction is opposed to erasure. So that's my initial reaction. I recognize the value of erasure, but I also feel like, I did mention this before, that in a way the memoryscape engagement should be additive. One should be adding to it, but not necessarily taking away. And then when something is left there, there's so many great examples of problematizing it or recontextualizing it, or the Budapest Sculpture Garden is it Budapest? Wait, I was trying to remember where yeah, is it outside of Budapest?
Yeah, it's Budapest.
It's outside of Budapest. They have the Sculpture Garden where they've taken all the Stalin statues and things and put them in a very different place. So by replacing them, they've totally changed the meaning, but they haven't erased them. Apparently in Baghdad, there is not a single, nowhere in the world, apparently, does there exist a statue of Saddam Hussein from that period. Now, maybe that's fine. On the other hand, it's an interesting fact that they've all been completely destroyed. They've been completely erased. So there's no way you can resuscitate a Saddam Hussein statue and say, oh, this was used in this way or whatever. There's so many great examples. One of my favorite examples was very early in my engagement with this work, sometime in maybe the 90s or early 2000s. I went to South Africa, and there was very offensive diorama of native people in the Natural History Museum. So it's so racist because, you know, the art was in the it was a museum down here, and the native people were in the Natural History Museum. So, and there was a diorama thing, I don't know if you know the word diorama, but anyway, the like thing, with them throwing spears or something. And what they did was they left it there. It's still there as far as I know. But there's a huge parallel exhibit talking about representation of native people. So it's turned this offensive image into a kind of history lesson about representation and about racism. So I mean, those kinds of examples are more interesting to me in general than purely erasing things. But yeah.
Thank you, Lee. It's very insightful and very interesting. Actually, I just recollected a very also interesting example of erasure is that now in Germany there is no surname Hitler anymore, which wasn't particularly widespread, but now they all became Hitler, Hischler, something else. Anyway, so since you're a founder of the digital tool of creating memory and collecting oral history, I wanted to ask you about the future. What do you think? What do you see now, and what are your projections and maybe thinking how the big data and artificial intelligence is going to change and develop the digital memoryscape? And also, what is this connection between the digital memoryscape and the physical memoryscape?
Yeah. You know, I'm very inspired by an author named Safia Noble, who's written a book called Algorithmic Redline. No, it's not called, what's it called? Algorithmic Oppression, I think it's called. And it's about the way in which, she doesn't frame it as memory, but it is essentially the same idea. It's the way in which certain stories are marginalized through algorithms, but also content prioritization on the internet. So the internet becomes a public space which has these same memory dynamics and power dynamics. So, for example, the example that she starts the book off, the book is now about 10 or 12 years old. When she started the book, according to her narrative, because she was with her young niece, and they were looking for the term black girls on the internet. So they get on the internet, and she puts in black girls, and the only thing that comes up is pornography and really racist kind of representations of black girls, like violence and, you know, just really awful stuff. And she shows the screenshot of this in the book. And she says, this is crazy, what's going on here, you know, because there's so many interesting stories of black girls. And so that kind of idea that the internet itself is a public space that marginalizes certain stories, highlights certain stories, some of that has to do, you know, the famous thing about Wikipedia is that most Wikipedia editors are white men in general, and that has its own problem. But in addition to that, there's also the kind of selection that goes on with Wikipedia. So only 18% of Wikipedia entries are women, et cetera. So, you know, and the search engines go to the biggest sites. So there's a question of who's a big site, who's a small site. So there's a lot going on in that. I didn't really talk so much about big data, more just around like how search works. Big data, I know less about. I don't know if you have thoughts about it, but yeah.
Thank you. Okay, I have another one. Questions about, you know, about the role of fictional film, false memory, fictional literature, and
love that. What about it? I mean, yes. What is its role?
How it's important, and sometimes about invented types of memory, and what do you think about the impact of fictional literature, fictional memory, false memory, fictional films for societies, for communities? Yeah,
there's so much complexity there. There was the
It's not
you
about
know,
public history, yeah, it's about popular history.
right, popular history, but again, you know, yeah. So, yeah, my cousin is a producer, a Hollywood-ish producer, and her first film, she didn't like the uniforms that were being. It was about Russia's first serial killer. My cousin's movie. It was called Citizen X or something. Anybody ever see this movie by any chance? Anyway. So it was a semi-historically accurate movie about a serial killer in Russia, right? Donald Sutherland was the bad guy. Okay. So anyway, she designed the uniforms in a way that she thought looked better than the real uniforms. And we got into this massive argument. This was 20 years ago. We got into this massive argument because I said, you can't do that. You can't mess around with historical fact. But I don't know. I don't really know the answer to that. I mean, yes and no. I mean, you know, so much of historical fiction has taught us so much, you know, so I don't know if it engages people, if it takes people in the right place. I feel like it's hard to be dogmatic as I was about that kind of stuff. I don't know, I'm sure people have thoughts about this. There are memoirs that are lies, and that strikes me as a place on the spectrum. So you have memoirs that are lies. If they don't call themselves fiction or fictionalized, and they purport to be the truth, that's an issue for me. But I think there's really hard to know the answer to that. I don't know, what are your thoughts on that?
I think that fictional literature, fictional memories is more attractive, more emotional, and more interesting for people than archives, for instance, because that's why it becomes more and more popular, and it's more useful. It don't need it so, you know, deep thinking, hard thinking, and hard work on history, because history is absolutely not easy issues, you know. And
I agree.
Yeah, sorry, I'm going to jump into this
Please.
discussion, but I do feel that there's obviously a danger or a risk, but it's problematic when history is packaged for you. I think what's poignant about memory work is what Louis said, it's the process. It's making you work to engage with history, to engage with memory, to engage with identity, to understand the lessons from the past. And if you have that pre-packaged for you, you lose half of the value of engaging with these questions in the first place. So I think people might find documentary film less exciting, but it's because you have to work when you watch a documentary film.
Their own practices with history.
Yeah. But so my preference is and you can do fictional representational film, but for me what's important is to not have it pre-packaged for you.
Just to support something there is the idea of having to work. I have somewhere, I think I have a picture of the Sarajevo Red Roses. Do people know that? It's a wonderful example of public art in Sarajevo. Anyway, it's basically what they did was artists filled mortar. Here it is, the Sarajevo Red Roses. I really like this because it forces you to work. I like that way you said that. These were where mortar shells fell. And, you know, Sarajevo is a multi-ethnic city, so you don't really know who died in Sarajevo during the siege of Sarajevo, right? You know, people died, but you don't necessarily know the origins of those people or the stories. So you know that something terrible happened here, and you know that people died. But the rest you kind of have to work at. You have to think a little bit through what's going on here and what the story is. And I like that they don't have any description or any didactic material, we might say. There's no didactic material telling you what to think about this. It's a sad, tragic thing that you can reflect on and think about, but beyond that, you don't. There's some of them have some plaques, but most of them don't have plaques. But yeah, I like the idea of having to work at something there. Yeah.
Please.
I guess you were first.
Thank you so much, and I would like to say that I'm grateful for the opportunity to attend your lecture offline and ask my question.
Okay.
And you mentioned that identifying new forms of heroism is important to reinforce our future, but now, how, in your opinion, can we break old and, in some cases, fake heroes that don't have any right to exist in our future?
Let me think. Let me try and think of a good way to approach that. I mean, every society, it goes a little to the question of erasure. Every society is always renovating. You know, first of all, people think that by building some big thing out of stone, they're going to make permanent a memory, a societal memory. But it doesn't work that way. So many of these things are invisible, actually. Right? So many are invisible, which in a way just means that people aren't interested in them. And some of them are highly visible because they're offensive and they're deeply bothersome. So then the question is like how, but there's constant renovation going on. There's constant renewal of new memory things happening in any society. So I think the question is just how you manage that process. So I would say the first step, this is on the most general level. I'm not speaking about Ukraine, really. But on the most general level, I would say the first thing is to imagine new forms of memorialization. What might those look like? Who is a forgotten hero? Somebody whose story has not been told? Somebody who is maybe represents something? A different kind of heroism, a different kind of virtue or characteristic or something. So maybe it's not a person, maybe it's a place or a movement or something like that. And then to think less about the erasure part, although I see that that's, Hitler example is really interesting. Yeah, I mean, there's some figures that are so offensive. I mean, Hitler in Germany is such, who mentioned that? Yeah. I mean, Hitler in Germany is clearly such an offensive image that you can't, it would be impossible to have that. So that has to be removed, but it has to be removed maybe and put into a different place or something. So I don't know, I think just the idea of adding new and being part of that renovation of the memoryscape.
Hi, thank you for your lecture, and I want to ask you a small question, a little bit trick one, because we have the situation when Russia creates new narratives, new memorialization of those soldiers who died during the special military operation, as they called it. They created some school desks for children, for like churches messes they have for this one. It's also kind of memory stick for Russian people, for Russian nation, but they use it in the wrong way. And my question is how to create the correctful memory stick to your nation after such mass atrocities that come to your land, that you will not overstep this propaganda and you will not overdo, and your memory stick in the future could not be turned into something bad, like, for example, like this school desk for children who will just grow up and join the special military operation in the future. And we have such cases right now in Ukraine. And also this question is kind of like similar one to this, but do we need a census to the memory stick so will not lead to double traumatization of people who survived the mass atrocities and not lead to the people who will be the future generations and will relive these actions because they see like this blood on the streets, this like destruction of the buildings and kind of. Thank you.
Wait, can I just clarify, did you say a census of the memoryscape?
Yes, like some...
I mean, I love those kinds of things. Can you just explain what you mean by that?
It's like to deny some events, to not talk about them, to prevent public access to these events, to some stories, to some facts, etc. So people will not be double traumatized, or these facts should be covered so the future generations will live in peace and security and those like related things that our world community, our democracies want to live out.
Is this the idea of like an inventory of the memories? It's different. A conversation that I'm just trying to think if this is the same as a different conversation.
No, it's kind of little different because like when we creating some memory stick, like I don't know, like monument, or we remade some I don't know, like hydroelectric station into some monuments that should be related to those Kakhovka Dam events that happened in Kherson region, and there are some stories that should be like banned from the public, and the government should put the censors on these stories, like to prevent public access to it, and should be only limited to like several people access. For example, like president or the Ministry of Defense, so people will not like cry or double traumatized or rethink this event in the future and something bad, or kind of it's like the information that was closed for the public about like Nazis or about the facts of genocide in Rwanda or Cambodia or other like Somali and kind of events that should be like, okay, you know about the events that happened, but you know the limited information, so you rethink these events for the future to not like repeat it, but you will not be traumatized a lot because of some cases, violent cases that could traumatize you psychologically or physically.
Yeah, I see more. I'm not sure I have a great answer for that, other than what you said. I mean, I think you've sort of explained it in its own way. I think. I mean, I guess to a certain degree, it comes to the question of what is government policy around memory and memorialization, you know, and that is tricky. That's tricky because you don't want government to be overly prescriptive or overly you want some kind of. But at the same time, you want guidelines of some kind, guidelines that speak about respect or appropriateness. We were talking about with someone in a different conversation. I was talking about whether it's appropriate for children. You know, this image of the stelae in Germany and the memorial to the murdered Jews of Europe. You know that. Oops, I was doing the wrong one. Anyway, the memorial to the murdered Jews of Europe is the huge memorial near the Brandenburg Gate in Berlin. And it has these things called stelae, which look like gravestones. And you have children playing on those. And whether or not that's appropriate, you know, you do want some kind of guidance about appropriateness, et cetera, and maybe hiding certain narratives or messages or purposefully celebrating certain other ones. There we go. You know, what is the right kind of, and what is the role of some kind of authority, whether it's the site authority or government or municipal government or federal government, to sort of say what is the appropriate use of these kinds of spaces. I like this myself, but I think that's a controversial statement. I think a lot of people don't like this. But I like this because it is some form of engagement. I like touching. I don't like overly distant kinds of things. But yeah, I don't think I've done a great job with the question, but thank you for it. Other?
If I may, I would ask two questions.
Sure, of course.
So one more on a theoretical side, and second more concrete. First is about, you say that memory is a form of truth-seeking and is a form of accountability. For now, actually, you can see, I imagine when you were traveling around Ukraine, you see a lot of examples of memorialization of the events of current war. But what, in your perspective, how can we make Russian citizens accountable and communicate this accountability to the global society? So it's one about how do we create the collective memory and accountability of Russian citizens. And second one is more concrete and about the past. You know that now the events of this war is very acute, is very traumatizing. But we also, in Ukraine, have unsolicited, unreconciled events of the past, atrocities, for example, like Second World War, and currently we are still getting back to the heritage of and legacy of the Ukrainian partisan movement, and the historical truth was not that obvious to global community. Especially, we have still unreconciled past relationship with Polish people, Ukrainian people, and for example, several news came up today, like Canadian government was not very favorable while Ukrainian president was at the same meeting with some representative of partisan movement. Also, the recent discussion with the Polish ambassador, who were absolutely not positive about naming streets in the name of Stepan Bandera, and we have been returning to this question for a lot of years, despite 4 of our presidents of Ukraine beg a pardon before Polish people for the Volyn tragedy. So maybe you can give your steer. How do we deal with the past when there was no proper closure? Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Yeah, the second question sounds more complicated to me for me. But on the first one, well, for one thing that you raised that I didn't really talk about that I think is so important is the question of audience, and international community. For example, I show another thing I show here is that I have this is the Cambodian killing fields, and there are. I'm coming back around, but just quickly as a parenthesis, there are 4 major tourism sites in Phnom Penh, in the capital city of Cambodia. One of them is the Royal Palace, the other is the National Museum, and the other 2 are genocide sites. So these are tourism sites, and that raises some really complicated questions, right? These are the actual skulls. They didn't make replicas of the skulls. They kept the original skulls of the people who had died in these mass graves. All sorts of complicated things. So at one point I did a project where I went there full of, to be honest, I was very negative and judgmental about this site. Very, very negative about it. Especially because tourists come wearing bikinis, and I mean, it's just weird. It's really weird. Hundreds, thousands, every day come in buses and sort of walk through quickly and things. So I found this a very offensive, negative example. So I got together a group of researchers, and we spent 10 days there in the very hot sun. We had 3 or 4 of us, 3 graduate students and myself, and we spoke about 10 languages between us, and we interviewed people, and we interviewed about 100 people for an hour long each interview. They were very willing to be interviewed. And to be honest, I totally changed my viewpoint about this because I realized that the audience is the international community here, right? That is the audience. And the audience is a future possible intervention. The sort of goal here is to, on some level, is to encourage an intervention around a future genocide. So that totally changed my thinking about it. Because suddenly because the interviews, everybody said in the interviews, they said, oh my God, I never knew that this happened. I had no idea. I had no idea that this happened. What could have stopped this from happening? You mean, wait, the UN could have possibly played a role? The international community could have stopped this? There was this kind of light bulbs going off in these tourists that changed my mind about the whole thing. I mean, it's still kind of disgusting in many ways, but still, giving those people, the people who were visiting it, a little bit of credit, I realized that actually they were having these educational experiences. So anyway, what was your question? No,
what shall we do with Russians to make them accountable and feel the collective guilt?
And also, I think you were talking about like, around different kinds of audiences here, right? Like it may be that a number of memory sites here might be aimed at international audiences, at the international community in some way. And that does change some design principles, I think. But the other thing that I was thinking of when you were talking is just this idea of celebrating different kinds of heroism, and different forms of resilience and different forms of, different kinds of power, like the power to resist, the power to resist occupation, the power to resist domination, the power to imagine a different kind of future or something in the future. So those are the kinds of things that I think could be also celebrated in addition to other things. But I avoided your second half of your question, though. But I think that's because it's not real. That's a really hard question for me. That's more of a question for everyone else in the room, I think.
Yeah, I mean.
Yeah.
Ukrainian historical question about what shall we do with legacy of partisan movement, and one, as it was said in one very notable phrase, one man's terrorist, another man freedom fighter. But how do we reconcile with another neighboring countries who suffered from the atrocity inflicted by our hero, actually? Shall we not praise the hero, or?
Yeah. I'll leave that as a rhetorical
question. It's been for years, but we have another question here.
Thank you. My name is Yulia. Could you please describe what was the most challenging case in your personal practice or theory work in field of memory?
Oh, the first thing that, I'm not sure if this is the most challenging, but the first thing that comes to mind is, going back to Argentina, is one of the founders of it's called the Mothers of the Plaza de Mayo, the Mothers Group, refused to acknowledge that her 2 sons had been killed. And it created a massive controversy because they were killed. There was evidence they were killed. There were remains, there were DNA testing, it was plenty of evidence. But she absolutely refused to acknowledge that they were killed. And she played this very powerful role in which she said, I want my children back alive. And the authorities said, well, that's impossible. And she said, I don't care. I want my children back alive. It's the only thing I will accept. And from a memory perspective, it really was destructive in some ways because it was impossible to commemorate people who were, in her, that she refused to acknowledge were dead. So it played a very destructive role in the memory movement, but at the same time, it was actually an incredibly powerful symbolic kind of act that she said, the only form of commemoration that's reasonable is that my children are returned to me. So it created a very complex dialogue in Argentine society. Anyway, that's the first thing that occurred to me when you asked, a place where people are not playing the roles that you might expect them to play, because they just have very, very strong emotional connections. These are very emotional topics. Everybody has emotion. I mean, mass graves are incredibly emotional places. Cemeteries are incredibly emotional places. Human beings are complex emotional people. So all of these kinds of things depend a little bit on people playing their roles, and if they don't play their roles, it is confusing. So I don't know if that's an interesting answer.
Make your own decisions or solutions?
I'm sorry?
Maybe you can remember some cases where it was about your own decisions or solutions, was most challenging for you personally.
Boy, I have to think a little bit about that. Most challenging. I mean, I guess I'm not sure exactly what the question is, when have I had a challenging kind of solution framework of some kind, like building something or creating something? I might have to think about it. I mean, all of these are challenging. These are all incredibly challenging, and none of them are very satisfying. I mean, that's the kind of grim, the grim thing about it is, I think most memory sites are not very good. I mean, that's the unfortunate thing about my field, is that when I look around, I see 80% of the things that I see I don't think are very interesting. I think that they're didactic, I think that they're traditional, I think that they're quite boring, I don't think that they play an interesting role in creating dialogue or accountability. I think most of them are not very good. So in that sense, and I have been a part of efforts, many, many efforts, where I have tried to push them in ways that I thought would be more interesting, and they don't. I remember one time a local conversation about World War II. The community wanted to create a big block, a big granite block with the names of the people on it. And I thought that was really boring, but the community won, and they did, and they built it. So I mean, I guess I feel like the really exciting thing is when something like the AIDS quilt happens that I showed there. The AIDS quilt is amazing. It's so beautiful, and it's not made of granite. It's tactile, it's ephemeral, it's changing, it's growing all the time. It's an amazing thing. So those are the really exceptions. But the majority of the work is working with stuff that is not very interesting, unfortunately. So that's a kind of slightly depressing note to wrap up on, but I don't know if we're wrapping up. Okay.
Dear Louis, thank you so
you.
much
Thanks.
again and again, and thank you all of you for being here, and it's a pleasure as usual. See you at Kyiv School of Economics, and I hope we'll see you again and again. And yes, дякую всім, хто був тут.
And thank you to everyone, and hopefully Louis will visit us again. And thank you for your questions. And thank you to our online audience. And you will be able to watch it again on YouTube.